What if the single most protected airfield in Russia just proved that nothing Putin builds can actually stay safe? What if one explosion in one country nobody expected to survive this war just erased a machine that can never be replaced again? Before we go any further, I need you to do 3 things for me. Hit that like button right now because it tells this channel that stories like this deserve to reach more people. Subscribe if you want to understand this war the way analysts do, not the way headlines do. And send this video to one person who still thinks this conflict is stuck in a stalemate, because what you're about to hear proves otherwise. Now let's talk about what actually happened, because the details here are almost hard to believe. There is a place in Russia called Engels 2. It sits near the Volga River in the Saratov region, hundreds of kilometers from the Ukrainian border, deep inside territory that Russian commanders once considered completely safe from any kind of attack. Foe are years. This base was treated like sacred ground. It wasn't just another airfield with a runway and a few hangars. It was the beating heart of Russia's long-range bomber force, the place where massive Cold War-era aircraft were armed, fueled, tested, and sent out to fire cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities, night after night, month after month, for more than 4 years. One of the aircraft based there is called the Tu-95. If you've never heard of it, picture something enormous, a plane over 150 feet. Long, with a wingspan nearly as wide as a football field, powered by 8 massive propeller engines, 4 on each wing. It was designed decades ago, during the height of the Cold War, back when the Soviet Union was racing the United States to build the most terrifying weapons on Earth. This plane could fly across entire continents without stopping to refuel. It could carry heavy cruise missiles thousands of kilometers and release them with brutal, calculated precision on targets far beyond the front lines. For more than 4 years now, this same aircraft type has been used to fire missiles into Ukrainian neighborhoods, not military bases, not battlefields, apartment buildings, hospitals, maternity wards, shopping centers, power stations that keep the lights and heating running for millions of regular families in the middle of winter. These strikes happen without warning, often in the dead of night, while children are asleep in their beds and parents believe, for just a few more hours, that their homes are safe. So when we talk about a base like Engels 2, we're not talking about some abstract military target sitting on a map somewhere far away. We're talking about the actual launch pad for the kind of terror that has reached deep into Ukrainian living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms for years. Every missile that has ever slammed into a Ukrainian city in the middle of the night likely started its journey right here, on this one stretch of tarmac beside the Volga River. Here's where the story takes its sharpest turn. On the night of July the 16th, 2026, Ukraine's security service did something that should have been almost impossible on paper. They launched a wave of drones and sent them flying 800 kilometers into the heart of Russian territory. 800 kilometers, through multiple rings of air defense systems, through radar coverage designed specifically to detect exactly this kind of threat, through jamming equipment built to scramble drone navigation, and through fighter patrols meant to intercept anything that got too close. Every single layer of protection that a modern military could construct around one airfield. And somehow, against all of that, those drones got through. They found a Tu-95 bomber sitting out in the open on the tarmac, not hidden, not tucked away behind concrete walls, sitting exposed the way these aircraft sometimes have to sit, no matter how advanced the defenses around them are. And the drones hit it. 3 days later, commercial satellite images confirmed exactly what had happened on the ground. The plane wasn't just damaged in some minor, repairable way. It was almost completely severed in half. The tail section had fully detached from the main body of the aircraft, sitting apart from the fuselage like 2 separate pieces of wreckage instead of one intact machine. Analysts who spend their careers studying exactly this kind of destruction looked closely at those images, compared them against known damage patterns, and used one specific word to describe what they saw: irreparable. That plane will never fly again. Not this year, not in 5 years, not ever. Now here's the part of this story that changes everything about how we should understand what just happened. Russia cannot build a new one. This isn't a matter of money. It isn't a matter of political willpower or a rushed emergency production order from the Kremlin. It's simpler and far more permanent than that. The factory that used to manufacture these bombers stopped production back in August of 1992. That was before the modern internet existed as we know it, before most of the pilots flying these missions today were even born, before Russia itself, in its current form, had fully settled into existence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The specialized tooling that once shaped these airframes, the supply chains that once produced the engines, the skilled workforce that once assembled every rivet and panel, none of it survives today. When one of these bombers is destroyed, it isn't like losing a car that a factory can simply build another version of next year. It's gone. Permanently. There is no blueprint waiting in a drawer, no supply chain quietly humming along in the background, no factory floor ready to start stamping out replacements. It simply does not exist anymore. Let that sink in for a second. Russia has one of the largest militaries on the planet. Russia has one of the biggest defense budgets in the world. And Russia cannot manufacture a single new unit of the very aircraft it depends on most heavily to strike Ukraine from long range. Every time one of these bombers is destroyed, the entire fleet becomes permanently, irreversibly smaller. There is no fixing that with money. There is no rebuilding that with time. It only moves in one direction, and that direction is down. And that is exactly why this particular strike on July 16th matters so much more than a simple headline can ever capture. Let's talk now about why this base was supposed to be untouchable in the first place, because understanding just how seriously Russia defended this location is what makes Ukraine's success here so genuinely remarkable. Engels 2 wasn't some forgotten outpost sitting quietly in the background of this war. It was the operational nerve center for two of Russia's most important heavy bomber regiments. Since the full-scale invasion began back in February of 2022, this base has served as the primary starting point for the missile campaigns that have devastated Ukrainian cities from Kyiv to Kharkiv to Odessa. Bombers took off from these very runways loaded with cruise missiles. They returned to these very hangars to refuel and rearm before the next mission. The technicians who maintained these aircraft, the fuel depots that powered them, the storage facilities holding the missiles themselves, all of it was concentrated right here in one heavily guarded stretch of Russian territory. Russian military planners understood as far back as December of 2022 that this base sat near the very top of Ukraine's target list. Ukrainian drones had already reached its outer perimeter once before, causing the first documented damage at the facility. So what did Russia do in response over the following years? They didn't just post a few extra guards at the gate. They poured an extraordinary amount of money, engineering talent, and construction resources into hardening the entire facility against exactly this kind of attack. Satellite images taken earlier this summer revealed something remarkable about the scale of that effort. Russia had been actively building at least 17 brand new reinforced concrete shelters at Engels 2, specifically designed to be large enough to fit these massive bombers inside them. These weren't small, simple structures you could throw up in a weekend. Each shelter had to be built wide enough and tall enough to swallow an aircraft with a wingspan close to 165 feet, something most standard military shelters, designed for ordinary fighter jets, simply cannot accommodate. That kind of construction takes serious engineering expertise. It takes real money. It takes months, sometimes years, of dedicated labor. But Russia didn't stop there. In a move that almost sounds like something pulled straight out of a war film, engineers painted full-size, two-dimensional outlines of bombers directly onto the tarmac itself. Fake aircraft shapes, flat and lifeless, painted onto bare concrete, designed specifically to trick drone cameras and confuse satellite analysts into believing real, valuable aircraft were sitting in positions where nothing but paint actually existed. It's a strange, almost desperate kind of defensive creativity, painting decoys onto pavement because the real machines are simply too precious and too irreplaceable to risk losing. On top of the shelters and the painted decoys, Russia surrounded the entire base with layered air defense systems, some of the most advanced surface-to-air missile batteries in their entire arsenal. They brought in dedicated electronic warfare units specifically built to jam and confuse the GPS and inertial navigation systems that guide incoming drones toward their targets. And then, after a previous Ukrainian operation destroyed multiple strategic bombers across several different Russian air bases in one dramatic, coordinated strike the year before, Russia made its single most drastic defensive decision of the entire war so far. It physically relocated the vast majority of its surviving long-range bomber fleet nearly 6,000 kilometers away, moving them out to a remote base far out in Russia's eastern territory, practically on the opposite side of the entire country from Ukraine. They physically moved their most valuable, most irreplaceable aircraft as far from Ukrainian reach as the geography of their own country would physically allow them to go. Concrete shelters, painted decoys, layered missile defense rings, electronic jamming systems, a 6,000-kilometer relocation of an entire fleet. Every single layer of protection that a modern military could possibly think to deploy, all stacked one on top of another around this one facility. And none of it was enough to stop what happened on the night of July 16th. Before we go any further into this story, let's pause here for a moment. If a story like this is genuinely opening your eyes to how this war is actually being fought behind the headlines, tap that subscribe button right now and drop a quick comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I rate every single one of them, and honestly, it's one of the biggest reasons this channel keeps growing into something bigger every single week. Now let's talk about why. Despite absolutely everything Russia did to protect this base, that bomber was still sitting out in the open on the exact night Ukraine decided to strike. Here's something most people never stop to think about when they picture a heavily defended military airfield. You cannot simply lock these planes away inside a shelter forever and call the problem solved. A bomber loaded with live cruise missiles cannot be armed while sealed inside a closed concrete shelter. The specialized munitions handling equipment needed to load those weapons requires open space and strict safety protocols that simply cannot be followed safely inside a confined, sealed structure. You also cannot run full engine. Tests on an aircraft this size while it's sealed inside a shelter? The heat, the exhaust, the sheer noise generated by 8 massive turboprop engines running at full power make it both physically impractical and genuinely dangerous to attempt indoors. And you certainly cannot carry out major maintenance work on landing gear, hydraulic systems, fuel lines, or the fuselage structure itself, while the entire aircraft is sealed behind heavy blast doors. These are not small inconveniences that a determined general can simply override with a strongly worded order. They are hard physical realities. No amount of money, no amount of political willpower changes the basic laws of how aircraft maintenance actually works in the real world. At some point, no matter how well protected a base is on paper, these enormous planes have to come out into the open air to be armed, tested, and repaired. And that exact moment, the moment of forced exposure, is precisely what Ukraine's intelligence services were patiently waiting for. The bombers present at Engels 2 that night had been rotated back from that distant eastern base specifically for maintenance work and crew training exercises. They needed to be sitting out on that tarmac to get that essential work done. Ukraine's intelligence services understood this operational rhythm intimately. They understood exactly when these planes were most likely to be exposed, when the base's defenses were thinnest, when the narrow window of vulnerability would briefly open before closing again. Sending drones 800 kilometers into hostile, heavily defended territory and striking a precise target during that exact narrow window isn't something that happens through luck. That kind of precision requires years of patient, methodical intelligence gathering. It requires careful, disciplined planning. It requires a level of persistence and attention to detail that most people, watching this war unfold from thousands of kilometers away, almost completely underestimate. Now let's talk about the numbers, because the scale of what Russia has already lost here is genuinely difficult to fully comprehend. Before this most recent strike even happened, independent researchers who have spent years carefully tracking aircraft losses throughout this entire war had already confirmed at least 10 of these specific bombers permanently destroyed. 10 out of a total operational fleet that stood at roughly 58 aircraft just a couple of years earlier. That means even before the July strike took place, Russia had already permanently lost more than 1 out of every 6 of these irreplaceable aircraft. Add this latest confirmed loss into that total, and the percentage climbs even higher still. Every single loss makes the underlying problem worse for every aircraft still flying. With fewer planes physically available, the remaining bombers are forced to fly more. Missions to maintain the same operational tempo. More missions mean the engines wear out faster than they were ever designed to. Faster wear means more spare parts have to be stripped from other, less airworthy aircraft just to keep a shrinking handful of planes flying at all. And that constant cannibalization means even fewer aircraft are genuinely mission ready at any given moment in time. It's a downward spiral that has no realistic exit ramp. And every single time Ukraine destroys another one of these bombers, that spiral gets noticeably steeper. Now, let's talk about what that 6,000 kilometer relocation is actually costing Russia every single day in ways that rarely make it into mainstream headlines. A bomber flying a combat mission from that distant eastern base has to travel roughly 7,000 kilometers westward just to reach the position from which it can even begin firing its missiles at targets inside Ukraine. Then it has to fly that same enormous distance back home again. We're talking about a total round-trip distance, over 12,000 kilometers for a single mission. A single combat sortie can keep an exhausted flight crew in the air for more than 20 straight hours. Now compare that grueling reality to flying from Engels 2, which sat only about 800 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. A mission launched from there could realistically be completed in a small fraction of that time, using a small fraction of the fuel and putting a small fraction of the wear and tear on engines that, remember, can never be replaced or rebuilt from scratch again. Every single mission flown from that distant eastern base burns roughly double the fuel of an equivalent mission from Engels 2. Every mission adds roughly double the mechanical stress onto engines that are already decades old and irreplaceable. Every mission pushes already exhausted pilots and weapon systems officers through nearly a full day of high-stakes, high-concentration flying right at the exact moments when their focus, judgment, and precision matter most for, successfully completing the mission and returning home safely. Fatigue at that level isn't just uncomfortable for a flight crew, it's genuinely dangerous. It leads directly to small mistakes, miscalculations, and delayed decisions during the most sensitive, high-stakes phase of any combat mission. By forcing Russia to keep the bulk of its remaining bomber fleet so far away from Ukrainian territory, Ukraine had already dealt A massive, sustained blow to how often, how efficiently, and how safely Russia could carry out these long-range strikes in the first place. And now, by successfully hitting the very base Russia still relies on for essential maintenance and crew rotation work, Ukraine has proven that even that distant, supposedly safe zone offers no real guarantee of protection anymore. There's one more piece of this entire story that almost nobody in mainstream coverage talks about, and it might genuinely be the most important part of all. Flying an aircraft like the Tu-95 isn't something that just anyone can quickly learn to do. It takes years of dedicated, specialized training to produce a pilot capable of safely and effectively operating an aircraft this large, this mechanically complex, and this operationally demanding. Russia maintains only a small, carefully guarded pool of pilots and weapon systems officers who are fully qualified to fly these specific long-range strategic missions. These are highly trained specialists, built up over years of accumulated experience, not people who can simply be pulled off the street and replaced overnight. Earlier in July, before the strike on Engels 2 even took place, Ukrainian drones also struck another Russian airfield that happens to host a dedicated training center responsible for certifying brand new military aviators. Stop and think for a moment about what that actually means for Russia's long-term capability. Ukraine isn't only destroying the physical bombers Russia relies on today, it is simultaneously going after the entire training pipeline responsible for producing the pilots Russia will desperately need years from now. That's not simply an attack on current, present-day capability. That's a direct, calculated attack on Russia's ability to rebuild that capability at any point in the foreseeable future. A pilot who is lost, injured, or forced into early retirement cannot simply be replaced by pulling a random person in off the street. Producing that level of expertise takes years of dedicated training and accumulated flight experience. By deliberately striking both frontline operational bases and dedicated training facilities within the same tight window of time, Ukraine is effectively squeezing Russia's long-range bomber force from two directions simultaneously, degrading exactly what Russia is capable of doing right now, while also quietly undermining what Russia will still be capable of doing 3, 5, or even 10 years down the line. If this kind of deep layered analysis is genuinely something you want more of on this channel, do me a quick favor and hit that like button before you scroll any further. It costs you absolutely nothing, takes barely 2 seconds, and it's honestly one of the single biggest ways you can support independent breakdowns, like this one continuing to exist. Now let's zoom all the way out and look at the much bigger picture unfolding across this entire summer. This wasn't just one lucky strike on one lucky night. Over the course of this summer alone, Ukraine has quietly carried out a coordinated theater-wide campaign against Russian air power across multiple regions simultaneously. Earlier in July, Ukrainian drones struck an airbase in occupied Crimea, directly hitting fighter jets sitting exposed inside their hangars. Just days later, they returned to that exact same location and struck 7 additional hangars simultaneously, damaging several more aircraft in one coordinated wave. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces even carried out a bold, direct ground operation at that same base, destroying yet another jet up close on the ground, far from any battlefield. Around that same stretch of time, drones struck an airbase in Russia's Voronezh region, home to fighter jets and dedicated strike aircraft responsible for dropping guided glide bombs onto Ukrainian frontline cities. Thermal satellite imagery later confirmed a fire, breaking out at that facility following the strike. That same region saw multiple additional strikes throughout the remainder of the summer, repeatedly targeting a bomber regiment that has played a central ongoing role in Russia's continuing offensive operations. Crimea, Voronezh, Saratov. 3 completely different geographic regions spread far apart across Russian and occupied territory. Strategic bombers, tactical fighter jets, dedicated strike aircraft, and specialized pilot training facilities, all targeted within the same tight window of time. This isn't random chance or scattered opportunism. This is a deliberate, carefully coordinated campaign specifically designed to weaken every single layer of Russia's air power all at once, both the physical machines flying missions today and the trained human pilots meant to keep flying them tomorrow. So here's where all of this ultimately leaves us. Russia spent an enormous amount of money, time, and engineering effort trying to fully protect Engels 2 from exactly this kind of attack. 17 reinforced concrete shelters, painted decoys across the open tarmac, multiple overlapping layers of air defense missile systems, dedicated electronic jamming units, a 6,000-kilometer relocation of its most valuable, most irreplaceable aircraft to the far side of the country. Every single possible defensive measure a modern military could realistically think to deploy, all stacked together around one facility. None of it was enough to stop Ukraine. Ukraine's intelligence services correctly identified the exact moment these planes would be forced into the open. Ukraine's drones successfully covered 800 kilometers of distance through some of the most heavily defended airspace anywhere in the world. And Ukraine's sheer persistence meant they kept coming back, strike after strike, no matter how many new layers of defense Russia continued to add around this one base. The bomber fleet that Russia depends on most heavily for its long-range missile campaign against Ukrainian cities is now smaller than it has ever been throughout this entire war, and it can never fully grow back to its original size. Every single mission flown from that distant eastern base continues to burn fuel and irreplaceable engine life at roughly double the normal rate. Every lost or retired pilot takes years to properly replace, if they can genuinely be replaced at all. And every single strike Ukraine successfully carries out continues to chip away, piece by piece, at a capability that Russia simply does not have the means to fully restore. There is a specific number that Russian military planners are almost certainly watching very closely right now, quietly, behind closed doors. It's the exact number of bomber losses their long-range aviation force can realistically absorb before this entire missile campaign against Ukrainian cities becomes something they are physically no longer able to sustain. And that number gets a little bit smaller every single time a Ukrainian drone successfully reaches another Russian airfield. A country that critics confidently predicted would collapse within 72 hours of the initial invasion just took apart, piece by piece, one of the most heavily protected weapon systems Russia still has left, using aircraft that cost a tiny fraction of what they actually managed to destroy. Not with massive tank columns, not with huge armies, sweeping across open fields, with patience, with precision, with a deep, detailed understanding of exactly when and where their enemy would eventually be forced into the open. That isn't a sign of desperation. That's disciplined long-term strategy playing out in real time. And it's quietly reshaping the direction of this entire war in ways that will likely take years to fully understand and appreciate. If this video genuinely helped you understand something about this war that you didn't fully grasp before watching it, that's exactly why this channel exists in the first place. Subscribe, share it with someone who honestly needs to see it, and stay close, because stories like this one are only just beginning to unfold.